Welcome to Crash Concepts, where the economy, energy, and the environment are explored. Up next, fresh ideas and insights into the factors that are driving the world and shaping your future. Presenting information you can't afford to live without, here's Chris Martenson.
Welcome, everyone, to this Featured Voices podcast. I am your host, Chris Martenson, and it is April 3rd, 2019. Pensions. We've discussed them here at Peak Prosperity over the years, pointing out that they are kind of a mathematical nightmare for everyone involved. But as bad as the pension nightmare seems on the surface, it's even worse below the covers. I recently had the chance to hear a true pension expert talk about how America's pension system is ripe for fraud and abuse and mismanagement. Sure, pensions routinely overpromise, but it's actually worse than that. They also routinely underdeliver because the people on the pension boards are often underqualified, outgunned, outmaneuvered by slick operators from sometimes predatory operations that simply cannot resist the honeypot of money tied up in pensions. Our expert today is Ted Siedle. He's been called the Sam Spade of money management, the financial watchdog, and even the pension detective. Born Edward Ahmad Hamilton Siedle, he grew up in Trinidad, in Venezuela, Panama, Peru, England, Uganda, Egypt, and the U.S. Certainly a very well-rounded, world-traveled individual. He is a former SEC attorney and former legal counsel. He is a former SEC attorney and former legal counsel and director of compliance to Putnam Investments. For over 20 years, he has owned securities trading and investment banking firms. His firm, Benchmark Financial Services, Inc., has pioneered over $1 trillion in forensic investigations of the money management industry. He's nationally recognized as an authority on pensions and investment management matters, having testified before the Senate Banking Committee regarding the mutual fund scandals, and as an expert in various Madoff and other litigations. In 2017, he secured the largest SEC whistleblower award in history of $48 million, and in 2018, the largest CFTC award in history at $30 million. Welcome, Ted.
Thank you very much for inviting me on your podcast.
It's just very excited to have you here. So let's start here. By way of background, Ted, I discovered that you too are a graduate of Simon's Rock Early College. I got out of there with an associate's back in 1982. It gave me a start that was otherwise unavailable. And I just had to point that out because I haven't ever interviewed another graduate of Simon's Rock.
Well, not only did I go to Simon's Rock, I am being awarded an honorary degree by Simon's Rock at commencement a month from now.
Really?
So, like you, I did not graduate with the Bachelor of Arts, and so they are awarding me the honorary Bachelor of Arts degree. The first one they've awarded in 35 years. I believe the last one was awarded to Isaac Asimov, who you may know was a very noted writer and scientist.
Well, congratulations. And what are they awarding this for?
I gather for my lifetime work investigating forensically Wall Street abuses and really working as an expert for the public to decode what Wall Street and its legion of experts have been foisting on the American public. I think, I have written about on Forbes that we're on the precipice of the greatest retirement crisis in the history of the world. And that makes perfect sense because, first of all, we have the largest elderly population in the history of the world. And our elderly in this country and in other parts of the world as well, but let's just focus on the United States. Our elderly are woefully unprepared to retire and risk in the decades to come. We will witness millions of elderly Americans, baby boomers and others, slipping into poverty. Too frail to work, too poor to retire will become the new normal for many elderly Americans. So our demographics suggest that pensions and the lack thereof, lack of retirement security, is a major national issue. And I have one of the top experts who's speaking on behalf of the public on that issue.
So let's divide this into its two pieces. First, I opened with the idea that there's a little bit of mismanagement, maybe some fraud, maybe some abuse going on in there. And you're talking about something that maybe is on the other side too, which is the math problem that exists here, which is rooted in demographics and maybe simple miscalculations of promises versus returns. So let's separate those two out. Let's go to the math problem to start. Pensions, how, everybody's heard the headlines, possibly 3 trillion, 4 trillion underfunded. Let's take people through the math of this a little bit. What does that mean when a pension fund is underfunded?
Well, when a pension fund is underfunded, it means it does not have enough money in the bank to pay all it has promised to pensioners or retirees. So it means that there is a gap between what's been promised and what's in the bank.
And that gap is measuring in the trillions now. Is that a correct assessment?
Yes, many public pension funds in the country, like in the state of Kentucky, is only 12% funded. Others are Saipan, which is a U.S. territory, was the first public pension to seek bankruptcy protection about 5 years ago. Illinois is in terrible shape. So around the country, there are many pension funds that are funded only in the teens, and the end is near. It is clear that with the limited amount of money they have on hand and the benefits that they're paying and that have been promised, that they will run out of money.
All right,
that big issue is the underfunding of pensions.
So in my own human terms, if I had a child I knew was going to go to a college that was going to cost $200,000, 12% funding would mean I have $24,000 set aside for that $200,000 liability that's upcoming.
That's right.
And so how does somebody like Kentucky first, how are they going to potentially close that gap? What are the mechanisms that are available here?
Well, the simplest way to understand pensions and the health of pensions is that there are three components. The three components of pension health are how much money goes into the pension. The second component is how is the money that is in the pension managed over, let's say, a 30-year period of time, a worker's lifetime, say 30 years. And then the third component is how much money is paid out of the pension. So the three components are how much money goes in, how the money is managed over 30 years, and then finally, how much money is paid out. If not enough money goes in, that's a problem. The pension will be unhealthy. If the pension is mismanaged over time, there's a problem, because no matter how much water you pour into a leaky bucket, the bucket will never be full. And the third issue is if too much money is paid out, then the pension will obviously run out of money over time. And so if more money is paid out than is going in and is being generated on the investments, then we have a problem there. So those are the three main issues. The fix is found in those three components. If you want to fix the problem, you either A, put more money in, B, manage the money more efficiently, or C, you take less money out. Now, option A and C, or 1 and 3, putting more money in is politically suicidal. Taxpayers do not want to hear that state pensions are running out of money or municipal pensions are running out of money and more money needs to be put in. Cutting benefits is potentially legally not on the table, may not be legal under state law. And of course, state workers are not going to be at all happy about. So that's political suicide too. So then the question is, what do you do? The one element that is least discussed is the investments. Are the investments being managed efficiently? And almost universally, they're not. And there are reasons for that, which we can go into, but the investment of the money is the issue that is discussed the least, and is an issue which the public is really pretty much unaware of.
All right, so Ted, this is the part I really want to get to, because the money in, money out is fairly easy to track, and a lot of people are already up the curve on that. You really opened my eyes when you started to discuss that second bucket, the management of that money. I mean, we all are assuming, there's even though there's a several $1 trillion shortfall, there's also trillions of dollars stuffed in these things. It's a big pile of money, and I guess I had the assumption that money was being managed not only efficiently but as well as possible. So let's go into that for a second. First, what we're really talking about here are public pensions. Is there a difference between a public pension and, say, one that's managed by a company? And then I want to get into this management. Who is it that's actually doing the management of these public pensions? So first, what's the difference? Second, let's get into who's doing the managing.
Well, public pensions are very different from private pensions because public pensions are not subject to any comprehensive federal law. Particularly ERISA is the comprehensive federal law that governs and protects private corporate pensions. But let me give you I've written an article in Forbes called The Top 10 Reasons Why Stealing from State and Local Pensions is the Perfect Crime. Why stealing from public pensions is the perfect crime for this, basically because these pensions are not run professionally and are not regulated. So let me rattle off the top.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. First, reason number one is that they're with over $4 trillion in assets in these funds. They have a boatload of money. So a few million or a few billion stolen is rarely missed. That's reason number one, lots of money. Reason number two, public pensions have boards. They're overseen by boards of trustees, which are they're composed of laymen that utterly lack any knowledge or expertise in investment or fiduciary matters. Few state or local statutes require public pension board members to meet any minimal standards related to pensions. So you have police, firefighters, sanitation workers, kindergarten teachers. These are who are on these boards. So time and again, when Wall Street comes calling on public pensions, Wall Street professionals are very adept at pulling the wool over these laymen's eyes. Mm-hmm. The third reason is that these public pensions are subject to politicization. So the composition of these boards and the decisions these boards make regarding pension investments are generally tainted by political considerations. So you will find a pension investing in a convention center or a football stadium. And you ask yourself, these are typically terrible investments. So how did this investment get there? Politics. The political climate was such that politicians said the city pension should fund the building of a football stadium. It may not make any sense, but those are situations where you very clearly see politics involved. So politicization of investments is reason number three why stealing from public pensions is a perfect crime. Reason number four is that while these state and local pensions are generally subject to public records laws that mandate transparency, these funds are so defensive about the decisions they make and skilled at thwarting public disclosure requirements that scams rarely get exposed. And I would encourage your listeners to, wherever you sit, there is a city, county, or state pension fund that is subject to freedom of information laws, your state access to public records laws. I encourage you to use those laws to write and get information about the public fund that is of greatest interest to you. And most of these funds today have websites, and there's a tremendous amount of information on these websites. So I would encourage you to seek transparency, request information, and continue to push for it, because while they are subject to public records laws, they are reluctant to comply. So the more members of the public that agitate for transparency, the better.
Mm-hmm.
Reason number 5 why stealing from public pensions is a perfect crime is what I alluded to initially, that they are not subject to ERISA, which is the federal law that establishes minimum standards for private pensions. ERISA was enacted to protect the interests of employee benefit plan participants by requiring disclosure of information and establishing standards of conduct and providing appropriate remedies in federal courts. ERISA does not apply to public pensions, so a would-be thief need not be concerned about any of ERISA's protections if they go stealing from public pensions. Reason number 6, and I'm racing through these, is we're still, not only are public pensions not subject to any comprehensive federal law, they are regulated by a thin patchwork quilt of state and local laws. And most of the issues that relate to managing pensions are unanswered by state and local statutes. So, for example, if your city, the city of Amherst, Massachusetts, pension wanted to invest in Bitcoin, is it legal? There's probably not an answer. So that's under state law or city law. So there's lack of federal regulation, lack of state regulation, and there's lack of federal and state law enforcement policing these plans. And most of these plans are not annually audited by independent certified accountants. No. I did an investigation of the $100 billion state of North Carolina pension. And the first observation I had was that the pension had never been audited.
Wow.
In its history. It is the only pool of money in the state. The housing authority, all the other pools of money in the state had been audited, just not the pension.
Wow.
And in response to my observation, the treasurer of the state, who was a young woman who had no investment experience, she said that the cost of an audit wasn't worth the benefit it would provide. Well, the cost of an audit would have been maybe $100,000. So the reason why the treasurer would not want to pay $100,000 to audit a $100 billion fund is because she knows what the audit would find.
Mm-hmm.
So those are some of the other issues, some of the big issues. The final two reasons why stealing from public pensions is a perfect crime is that number 9 is that ever-growing percentages of the money in these plans are being swept into offshore accounts with illiquid, hard-to-value assets where nobody's even checking to see if the money's there. So significant amounts of money from, let's say, CalPERS or any of the largest pension funds, are actually supposedly in the Cayman Islands. So somebody has made a decision that it is prudent to invest state workers' money in the Cayman Islands, which lacks any of the protections we have in the federal, state securities, and other banking laws that we have here in the United States. But nobody even knows if the money's actually there.
That's astonishing.
I have worked on cases where, when we look, we find the money's not there and hasn't ever been there. And so the final reason that stealing from public pensions is a perfect crime is because as long as taxpayer rage is focused on the amount of money going into these plans and the supposedly rich benefits they pay out to state workers and retirees, then no one is focusing on investment scamming in the portfolio, which is where I'm focused. And so that's the piece that's missing, and I'd like your listeners to think about is we've talked a lot about money going into these plans and the supposedly rich benefits they pay out. Let's focus for a while on who's scamming the investments.
All right. Well, Ted, fantastic summary. I'm literally agog that this could be that this could be this bad. The idea that you have hundreds of billions of dollars that are never audited. My summary is poorly regulated, unaudited, staffed with people who are unqualified in many respects, with a giant pot of money. What could go wrong?
Exactly. And increasingly investing in opaque, offshore, illiquid assets, and increasingly thwarting the state public records laws. CalPERS and every pension in the United States that has invested in hedge funds, private equity funds, and other what we call alternative investments, i.e. not stocks and bonds, have interpreted state public records laws to read that these investments may be kept secret. So we have, for the first time in the history of this country, 30% or so of the assets of all of the nation's public pension funds, 30% of $4 trillion, let's say, is in secrecy accounts, which means that has been deemed not subject to public scrutiny, not subject to disclosure under public records laws. That's never happened in the history of this country. And that's where we're at now. And that is, to me, that's what makes this the most dangerous time for state pensions in the history of this country.
So we have 1.3 trillion, if I'm doing my 30% of 4 trillion properly in my head, we have about 1.3 trillion that's in secret. We don't know where it went, but trust us, it's being managed properly and it's going to deliver a tasty return. Again, what could go wrong? So Ted, take us through real quickly, because I really want to burrow into this. But first, we used a term. Help people understand what forensic accounting means, because I want to give people some clues what they might look for if they decided to, unbutton their own local fireman pension fund. Where would they start looking? But let's back up. What is forensic accounting? What does that mean?
Well, I'm not a forensic accountant. I'm a forensic lawyer. But I straddle both worlds in that my specialty is in investment matters. So that's what I look at, both the investments and the law. But forensic simply denotes of a quality that would be acceptable in court. So when you're doing a forensic analysis, I often tell people that the work I do is similar to the show CSI Miami. Mm-hmm. And in the show, the investigators go into a room where there's a dead body, and they ask, did the body die of natural causes, or was there foul play? in my work, I go into a dead or dying investment or pension, and I ask, is the pension dead or dying because of natural unforeseen forces, like simply the stock market went down, or was there foul play? And foul play is defined as conflicts of interest, hidden or excessive fees, and violations of law. Those are the things that I look for in my forensic protocol that I've developed. So forensic means that you are doing an investigation which will produce a quality report that can be submitted in a court of law. It will be used in a legal context. And the things that I look for, and I would encourage your members to look for, are those three things: conflicts of interest, hidden and excessive fees, and violations of law. These pensions universally underreport the fees they're paying. That is a big issue, because they are paying higher fees to Wall Street, exponentially higher, 10 times higher today than they were 10 years ago. And so that is something I would encourage your listeners to look at, because I don't know a single pension in this country that properly reports the fees they're paying. I.e., they're all underreporting the ever-growing fees they're paying. And of course, your listeners should be savvy enough to know that the fees you pay are tremendously significant to the intelligent investor, because an investor, the only thing we can control as investors are the fees we pay. We can't control the outcome, but if we keep our costs low, we increase our chances of having superior net performance. That is, gross performance minus the cost of fees, net performance. If these funds are paying out 2, 3, 4, 5, 6% a year in fees, and the market's only making 5, 6, 7% a year, then the net performance, well, the majority of the net gains are going to Wall Street, not to the public, not to the participants in these funds. So that's why it's so critical to look at fees in investing, and particularly when you're investing in high-risk, high-cost, opaque investments like hedge funds, private equity funds, venture funds, real estate funds. All of those funds, fees are of paramount concern, because the fees are far greater than investing in, let's say, an index fund.
So let's take this all the way through. So, hey, we walked into a room. We can't find the body, but there's a lot of blood. We're looking for the body in this investigation. Let's go back to point number 3. You said about how it's, pensions, public pensions are ripe for being stolen from. Politicization of things. You said stadiums, real estate. They might invest in really kind of hokey local projects that don't return. Well, real estate's been just like a slam dunk, really strong return asset for portfolios for many decades now. How have public pensions fared in that arena, if we're looking for clues that might say politicization happened here?
Well, one of the things, let's backtrack for a minute there. You said, what could your listeners be looking into?
Yeah.
One of the things we always look at is when you see a local pension investing in a local deal, whether it's real estate or a brewery or whatever, venture capital, that's always suspect, because that typically means that this was not an arm's length transaction where they scoured the universe to find the best investment for the pension, but there's a high risk that the local entrepreneur, promoter, used political connections to walk this deal into the pension. So one of the things I would look for is if you're in a city and you notice that the city pension has a big real estate holding in its portfolio, look at how's it done. Has that investment done well for the pension or badly for the pension? If it's done great, then maybe you don't have to look any further. If it's done terribly, and it's a for-profit helicopter landing port, you might say, well, how the hell did the city decide this was a smart thing to do? And who was behind it? And the performance seems to be terrible. But in the investigations I've done, like one I did in the state of Rhode Island, the state actually did horribly in real estate investment. I forget, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but over a 40-year period, the state's investments in real estate had produced, I think, a negative 3% or something like that.
It's hard to do.
It's pretty hard to own real estate for 40 years and lose 3%. In fact, short of having a nuclear bomb leave radioactive waste on the property, I would think it'd be pretty hard to lose over a 40-year period. So what we do see is that real estate is a strong investment and is actually the first alternative investment pensions invested in. Alternatives to publicly traded stocks and bonds. So real estate has been in pension portfolios for decades. But in many cases, you see that the real estate has done very poorly.
And a lot of the explanation for that poor return has to lie in the bucket 2, mismanagement. This has been or not efficiently managed, as you said, but there's certainly clues there to suggest if you're doing that poorly in real estate, it's almost impossible to be that bad randomly. So there's probably something there to look at.
Yeah, and real estate investments in public pensions are packaged by Wall Street in ways that are very different from what your typical direct real estate investor would be involved with. So, I mean, you can look, they can be fund of funds where you're investing in a partnership that invests in other partnerships that invest in REITs, and you're paying 2, 3, 4 levels of fees. So the investments, the real estate investments that you will find in pension portfolios may be very different from what a local real estate investor would invest in, and may perform very differently, and most certainly would have layers of fees attached that a direct investor in real estate would not experience.
So, Ted, I'm really curious about something. Roughly 10 years ago, when I was first looking into pensions, because I've been sort of curious about this for a long time, and this would be before the great financial crisis, roughly speaking, pensions were managed conservatively, if we would look at it that way, with a 60-40 split bonds to stocks. So 60% bonds, 40% stocks. Today, the data I have shows that that's being entirely reversed. 60% in stocks, 40% in bonds, a lot less conservatively managed. Obviously, the great financial repression that the Federal Reserve did, driving interest rates down, pushed pensions towards needing higher returns. I'd love to hear your take on their assumed rate of returns next. But first, given this massive increase in equity exposure and the big, huge rebound in equity prices, courtesy of easy central bank policies, pensions should be in far better shape than they were 10 years ago. Are they?
No, they're not in better shape. And one of the problems you have today when you look at pension asset allocation is many of the allocations are being mischaracterized. So they're not 60-40 or even 70-30. The structure of the investments, the composition of the portfolios is more confused and obscure than ever today. So whatever you see in virtually every pension I've ever looked at, if you look at their investment holdings, you will see that some of the funds and the products that they're invested in are mischaracterized. And they're mischaracterized to appear far less risky than they really are. So that's something you really need to take into account. They've actually gotten into far riskier investments, and the killer is they're paying 10 times the fees they used to pay. So they're not performing. They should be, they could be, but they're not. They're paying more to Wall Street than ever, and they're performing terribly for the most part.
And these higher fees, I assume this is because pensions know they're behind the eight ball. They've been sold a bill of goods, which is, oh gosh, you're going to have to work extra hard to make up some lost ground. So they're swinging for the fences, possibly. Of course, they want to underreport the amount of risk they're taking. I understand the drive for that. But really, honestly, if we want to go to the headwaters of the Nile, a lot of this has to be laid at the feet of the Federal Reserve, seeking financial repression, driving interest rates to a place that's so low that investors, not just pensions, who are yield starved, have had to do some really crazy things to just try and survive, given their financial parameters and all of that. It has not the environment itself been also conducive to really forcing these pensions to do some crazy stuff?
Yeah, the environment has, clearly, with interest rates remaining absurdly low. That has made it more difficult than ever to achieve their assumed rate of return. Most pensions, I think today, most pensions assume that they're going to get a rate of return on their investments of 7 to, let's say, 7.25%. That is their stated return. Their actuaries have signed off on this. I don't know about you, but I would love to get 7.5% return, or 7.25%, or 7% return, or even 6.5%. I will pledge to you today, I will invest $10 million in a guaranteed 6.5%, 7% investment. If you've got one that is ironclad, guaranteed, to give me 7%, I will give you $10 million of my money to manage. And so these pensions almost universally claim that they will make 7% a year. Warren Buffett himself has said that is an unrealistic return. He discussed this extensively in his Berkshire Hathaway annual report a few years ago. So they have assumed rate of returns of 7%, and Wall Street's solution to every problem is the solution to your problem is to pay us more money. So Wall Street says if you need to get 7%, then you got to pay us 3%. Instead of paying us 0.5% or 0.1% as you'd pay in an index fund, you need to pay us 3% to be in a hedge fund. So the Wall Street solution to every investor problem is always and will always be pay us more fees. And that, as Warren Buffett will tell you, and that's what they've done. They've paid greater fees to be in ever riskier rolls of the dice, and the net result has been the higher fees and the greater gambling has resulted, predictably, in worse performance. That's where we're at today.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the Peanuts comic strip with Lucy yanking the football away. I'm not sure how many more examples we need to understand that Wall Street operates in its own best interests and they play fast and loose whenever possible. You watch things like The Big Short or any other of the exposés that come out, and guess what? When there's a lot of money involved, people will do anything they possibly can within the letter of the law, and many of the coyotes at the edge of that will do whatever they can sort of outside the boundaries of the letter of the law, and some of them will just commit overt fraud. And I was shocked. I mentioned in the intro, I found out that you had been an expert in the Madoff litigations, and just to look at what Markopoulos had done. And for those who aren't familiar, Markopoulos was a private individual who was looking at the returns of the Madoff fund, which were publicly disclosed, and said these are impossible. First off, he would have to have been basically consuming more than were the options that were actually available for the entire universe of SPX index funds. But anyway, he just looked at the stuff, said clearly impossible, hands it to the SEC on a silver platter. Here you go. Here's the data. Totally impossible. And I think it ran, I mean, sure, you know more than me, but I think it ran for many years, maybe 10 years after the first disclosure. So these things are there. They're rampant. They should be expected. And still, I think somehow, things like the Madoff scandal go away and people assume that we took care of the bad stuff and now we're back to reasonably fair and open operations. It just feels to me like Lucy yanking the football away, that people should go in with the understanding that fleecing is what you should expect, it's not the exception, it's the rule. And therefore you need to have, please go ahead if that's enough to.
That's absolutely right. I think I mentioned to you all in my speech the other day in Fort Lauderdale that I am finishing a book called How to Steal a Lot of Money.
Great.
And How to Steal a Lot of Money is about how Wall Street and investment scammers steal money perfectly legally. This is a practical guide to investment scamming. It's based on true events, and it's how to steal legally, not how to steal illegally. It's how to steal legally. Every device I mention in the book we go into is perfectly legal, and it is not against the law in this country to sell an investment that has no chance, zero chance of ever producing a decent rate of return. And so that's where it's at. You can sell anything as long as you do it in the right way with the right disclosures, and it'll be perfectly legal. And there's a tremendous amount of common practices on Wall Street that make no sense, that are obviously wrong, but they're legal. So when I testified in the Madoff cases against Madoff feeder funds, these are funds that pensions invested in these funds, feeder funds, that gave all the money to Madoff to manage. So it was a feeder vehicle to get into and the feeder fund said, well, you can't sue us. We wrote right in the prospectus. And they did. There is a chance the broker managing the money, Madoff, may, quote unquote, abscond with the assets. We disclosed he might steal. You can't sue us. So that of course is the most absurd example, but short of that, you can pretty much disclose away any kind of wrongdoing you can imagine. So Wall Street and investment scammers get away with stuff that is outrageous. And How to Steal a Lot of Money book is sort of my take on financial literacy, and I'm hoping that a number of colleges will start using it as a teaching device, because investors need to understand that when you deal with investment scammers, Wall Street, whatever, you are really involved in a life or death struggle over your money. And you need to go into the relationship with that understanding that they are not there to do what's best for you, and you need to be eternally vigilant. So I think this is and I think by explaining one of the chapters of the book is called How to Create a Fake Resident. Now, Forbes, when I wrote an article about this on Forbes, they didn't like it. They took it down. They said, you're teaching people how to commit crime. I said, no, I'm not. I'm teaching people how to spot a fake resume. And one of the things I have in there in how to create a fake resume is to claim to have obscure sports accomplishments. In other words, accomplishments in sports that no official body ever records. And what we saw recently in this college scandals thing is that students were being given sports scholarships in obscure sports where they were admitted to the school to be on the sailing team or the rowing team, where nobody at the school would ever know if they ever sailed or rowed. So the purpose of my book, How to Steal a Lot of Money, is to raise awareness of how investment scammers operate within the law and and at the fringes of the law, and to reduce the likelihood that people get scammed as opposed to trying to create a new generation of criminals.
All right, Ted. Well, when that book, How to Steal a Lot of Money, comes out, let's do another interview, because I will help you get a lot of those books out into public, hopefully, because it's an important concept. And here's my maxim in life: if money's involved and people are involved, there's going to be fraud and theft involved. It's just how people are wired. And I noted recently that I'm sort of smiling as I say this, but I found it kind of sad. In Illinois, where they have just an extraordinary pension shortfall going on, that the Federal Reserve official in charge of that region actually suggested publicly that one of the ways they might close the gap was to put an extra 1% levy on top of the existing real estate taxes, essentially mining the equity of homeowners in order to cover the liability shortfall over on the other side, as if the state balance sheet consisted of, the equity in people's homes, the liabilities plus the assets and the pensions, that somehow that could all balance. Meanwhile, it was the Fed itself that created a lot of this trouble by creating the financial repression in the first place. I thought that was just a really inappropriate way to go about first creating the problem or feeding it, and then suggesting that the solution to it was to go after number one in your list. We need just more money in, and we're going to harvest the equity. We're basically going to leverage our balance sheet. I did not like that solution at all, but people should increasingly expect that going forward, shouldn't they?
Yeah, they should. And I've been proposing to do forensic investigations in Chicago and in Illinois going back to 2004. Mm-hmm. I was written up in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times for a proposal to investigate. It was clear to me 15 years ago that the Chicago funds were being and the Illinois funds were being policed, and I sent a proposal to them, to the boards in those cities, Springfield and Chicago, and the boards said they would consider having a forensic review done, but they ultimately, obviously, decided that they would not look good, so they shot it down. But the fact that they were considering it was written up in the New York Times. But getting back to the other point you made, and this is something I regularly tell people: any human who sits with other people's money long enough will sooner or later turn to thinking how they can convert that money to their own. Mm-hmm. So that it's human nature that if I gave you $1 million and said, hold it for me for 10 years, I'm going off on a trip around the world, there's a good chance that at some point when I'm gone, you will think about, could I borrow a little of that money? Maybe I'll use some to go on a trip. I'll pay it back later. Or I got a great idea. I'll invest in the stock market and get 10%, and I'll keep the 10% because all he said was, give me my $1 million when I come back. So it is human nature. And so whenever you're dealing with humans or algorithms and computers with your money, you should be eternally vigilant.
Well, absolutely. And for the final question here, I watched Illinois recently floated another bond offering where they're going to go into debt to put money into their pension. The issue is, I think it's a dumb idea, but that's not what my question. My question is, looking at the rate, the yield that those bonds went off at, I couldn't understand them because it was just a few tens of basis points above what I would consider to be, it was negligible. And so my question here is, it seems like whoever's buying those bonds is assuming that if Illinois goes under, in this example, or say Kentucky, that there will be some sort of a bailout, that like those bonds are somehow covered in some way, possibly. Is it possible in your mind, Ted, that a federal bailout could happen of these state pensions? Is there a mechanism for that? Could you ever see that happening? Or are these people really sort of wishfully, maybe ignorantly assuming that their money's safer than it is?
Well, I think there will be bailouts. The alternative is, chaos, disaster, Armageddon. I mean, it's like when people say we should cut Social Security benefits. Well, the majority of people who get Social Security live on nothing but Social Security. If you cut Social Security benefits, people will die. People will get sick. People will not be able to get health care. People will be elderly people will be thrown out of their homes, their apartments, whatever. If the state of Illinois truly went bankrupt, it would be Armageddon. What people would take to the streets? What are you going to do? Mm-hmm. No electricity, no water, no. I mean, it's so. We seem to have a certain disregard for territories like Puerto Rico. We will allow them to go bankrupt, but the notion that a state will be allowed to go bankrupt, I don't see it happening. So there will be, Wall Street will say, we've got a solution. Let's sell some bonds, pension obligation bonds, whatever. The solution Wall Street offers always is pay us more fees, pay us to underwrite bonds. There'll be many solutions offered. Taxing property owners is always popular as well. But in the end, a bankruptcy of a state, I don't see it happening.
All right, and so if I followed all this correctly, pensions are publicly managed. They are subject to freedom of information laws. People would be able to, if they were interested. Let's say I know somebody who's a firefighter who I care about a lot, and they have a firefighter's pension. He's counting on it. So if I was so interested, I would be able to go in and request the records and start to take a look and see what they're invested in and start to poke at that. And if I found something that seemed interesting or curious or questionable that I wanted to follow up further, what's the mechanism there for shining light or being able to exert any sort of leverage or influence on that process?
Well, what we were able to do in Rhode Island, which was very innovative, was we crowdfunded forensic investigations of the state pension. Basically, through crowdfunding, we can have a nation of citizen inspector generals, where the citizens of the state or county say, we're wondering, we have concerns about how the city pension fund's being managed. We're going to raise $20,000 on the internet, donations of $50 each or whatever, $100 each, to crowdfund an forensic investigation of the pension. Likewise, you could do that for your city water supply. Let's say the citizens of your town believe the water's tainted. Raise $5,000 to hire someone to do a water analysis. So we are, with this age of crowdfunding and internet funding, there is a vehicle to hire forensic experts to investigate on behalf of the public anything the public feels strongly about. So for those who are interested, if you type in my name, Edward Siedle, and Rhode Island pension crowdfunding, you will see that we had 3 successful crowdfunded, or was it 2? Maybe it was 2. 2 successful crowdfunding investigations, Rhode Island of the Rhode Island Pension Fund, and we delivered those findings to the SEC and raised awareness. And the state of Rhode Island stopped investing in hedge funds after losing $500 million. So that was the result there. And they increased the disclosure on fees to 10 times. The fees were the disclosed fees when I started investigating in Rhode Island were $10 million. Within 5 years, we forced them to disclose that the fees were $90 million.
Wow.
9 times greater. So I would encourage you all to get as much public information as you can from the public pensions in your area. Be an agitator, be a thorn in their side, because they don't like to give the information out, but they're required to. And if you find some interesting things, think about crowdfunding an investigation, having a professional brought in to examine the facts, prepare a report, and then give the report to state and local regulatory and law enforcement.
Wow, that's fantastic. It's a great idea. And for those listening who might be listening on YouTube, at our website where this is also posted, we will be putting in the links to the top 10 reasons for stealing the Forbes article, as well as the results from the Rhode Island crowdfunding search that Ted just recommended, because we think you should read those. And again, citizen activation sounds like the thing that is going to be needed in this case. And that's usually the case. Without accountability, without daylight being shown on these things, imagine a giant pot of money that's just sitting there. Listen, it's not is the possibility that something funky's happening there. It's definitely happening. So that's just the human nature. So Ted, thank you so much for your time today. I can't wait to have you back on to talk about your book, How to Steal Money, legally, of course. And I really applaud you for the work that you're doing. It sounds, not just sounds, but it's incredibly valuable to have somebody out there poking around and making sure that things are being managed as well as can be, and shining light on that. So thank you for that work. Thank you for your time today. And is there any place you would direct people who want to follow your work more closely?
Well, I have a website, which is benchmarkalert.com, but I write a monthly column for Forbes, and the column is entirely about forensics and pensions. And so I'm not a reporter writing about what other people's work. I write about what I find. So I would encourage you all to just type in my name and Forbes, and you will find my monthly column on there.
Well, fantastic. We'll certainly be doing that. And again, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.